not, we have to do it a different way. Oh, here we go. Okay, now it's going. Okay.
Okay, and Stacy's just coming on, so you can co-mod her.
Okay. Okay. And I think we're live.
It told me that it's being live streamed, so yes.
Okay,
hopefully that
everyone.
makes it elsewhere.
I can see that it's live, yeah. So and welcome everyone to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we're going to be talking about climate denial. I see I have a little bit of move a little bit over to the side to get the light out of there. I'm going to be talking about climate denial, and let me stop sharing here to get back a little bit. So the reason for talking about this is, first of all, climate denial, which is, I've been like talking about climate change for 20 years, giving talks on climate change around the world. And certainly in the early days, there was lots of climate denial, just straight up, hey, it's not happening. It's all BS and whatever. Now that's actually changed quite a bit in the last few years. And one of the main reasons, I think, is that everyone with their own two eyes can see that climate change is happening. They notice that the climate is not the same as it was when they were younger. And also there are things happening that really almost never happened before, or extremely rare events like, 500-year floods in 5 years or things like that. And so we're all seeing it with our own eyes. And therefore, there's less of the kind of obvious climate denial, like it's not happening kind of thing. So denial is sort of morphed a little bit. And what you see, though, is that now that we've gone on YouTube, is that there's been more and more, we're getting more visibility than when we were just on Clubhouse. And the Clubhouse group was kind of dedicated to people that were focused on climate, interested in learning about climate. So we didn't really have a lot of deniers, although we did have a show or two where we invited a denier on. But with YouTube, it's open to a much wider group of people. And therefore, there's a lot of more comments about things that are really just not true. And even though there's sort of this negative thing about highlighting what a denier says and giving them any oxygen at all, I think it's actually a very useful way to improve your knowledge of climate science, is to hear the arguments that they're making and then understand what the response should be, or what the proper scientific response is. And we're also going to talk a little bit about denial on the other side, on people who think that the world's going to literally end, I mean, for humans at least, in a year or two kind of thing. And that's also denial of a different kind. But those are people that are, and I think that that's also a problem, in that when you talk to climate, when you hear from climate deniers, they always say, you all said that the world's going to end by now, and it didn't. So you're all wrong, and therefore everything you say is wrong. Well, really very few people that actually say that. There's one guy, Guy McPherson, who a lot of people in the comments say, why didn't you have him on? Why didn't you have him on? And I consider him to be a denier too, but just on the opposite side. So anyway, that's the essence of what we're going to talk about. If you have your own favorite climate denial things, then you can bring them up too in the discussion. And so what I thought I would do is pull up, and just take me a moment here. And then we'll just start with this one right here. And I need to switch over. First, I have to turn off that. And okay. So let's go to Zoom and go to share. And here we go. Let's see if this works. Nope, I don't even know what that is. Turn this off. Close white. Oh, it's a whiteboard. I don't want a whiteboard. Sorry about this. This is kind of, we're doing Safari. Share Safari. Try that again. Okay. So can you see that, Eli? Do you
Yeah.
see a comment section? Okay.
Yeah.
So here's SJB on 5XT, I guess. And this is just kind of the typical kinds of things that you see in comments. And C says CO2 at 180 parts per million at the end of the ice age was dangerously low to wiping out all life. Humans burning fossil fuels have helped to increase some of that CO2 back into the atmosphere, ensuring that it doesn't happen again. So this is under the general, and again, I'm going to be using the word denier, okay? And then deniers don't like that, of course. They think, and many of them say, well, we don't deny that the climate changes. It changes all the time. That's one of their favorite, actually, denial talking points. But even those who say humans are still changing the climate, I'm just going to group them all as deniers because they might say they're changing the climate. In this case, it's a good thing, right? That's so. So when I mean denier, I mean those who say that either human-caused climate change isn't real, or human-caused climate change isn't bad. And there are probably a few other versions of that too. So we can get into that as well. So anyway, so here's someone saying that CO2 used to be very low. We almost all died during the last ice age when it was 180 parts per million. But of course, that's not true at all. I mean, life did okay. We had humans lived back then. This is only about 15, 20,000 years ago. It was before civilization developed, before we had agriculture and all that kind of stuff. But there were still, maybe a million or two, few million humans around, and did okay, and lots of other species and plants and everything. So the idea that there is a point where if there's not enough CO2, then of course that would be a problem. But we were 100 parts per million less than the pre-industrial level of 280 back in the Ice Age. It was 180. And by the way, one of the amazing things about the Ice Age, which again, only like 15,000 years ago or so, is when it was only 100 parts per million of CO2 less than it was 200 years ago, the pre-industrial amount, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. So that 100 parts per million less, that cooled the Earth enough to cause ice sheets to grow, and we had 2 miles of ice above where is now Boston, a huge amount of ice.
You meant higher.
And therefore
higher.
That came out of the ocean. And
sea levels were higher,
amazing,
right?
I think. Sea levels were lower.
We're lower. It's in the last
We're lower.
interglacial, when CO2 was this high, sea levels were much higher.
Yes. Sorry.
Several interglacials.
In the interglacial. Now, if we go back before the last ice age, yes, temperatures were about where they are now, and sea levels were, I forget, 75 feet higher or something like that than they are now. But then if you, but I'm just trying to make the point that here's someone saying, hey, don't worry, we almost died when we had the ice age, and thank God we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere. And I'm just trying to give you the context for that. That 100 parts per million less, we had 400 feet lower sea level. Florida was 3 times wider than it was, and you could literally walk from where currently Russia to Alaska, which is how people came over to North America, and animals. They just walked over because it was it was a land bridge because sea levels were 400 feet lower. So that's a little bit. Now, what have we done? That was 15,000 years ago, 100 parts per million less. And now, in the last 200 years, and most of it in the last 50 years, we've increased CO2 by 140 parts per million. 140 parts per million. Now, it takes a long time to warm the Earth completely, so we haven't seen the effects of that whole 140 parts per million. But when we do, the last time CO2 was as high as it is today, sea levels were about 75 feet higher. And that would, of course, would wipe out all coastal cities and most island nations and things like that. So this idea that, hey, CO2 used to be low, and there's other versions of this, and that is CO2 is plant food, and therefore it's good. And by the way, all living things you see, all the plants and all the animals that you see are made out of carbon that came from the CO2 in the atmosphere. So everything you see that's alive is made out of CO2 from the atmosphere. And then there's some CO2 in the oceans for other things, but on land. And that's kind of an amazing thing when you realize that CO2, when we say 420 parts per million, which is what it is, that sounds like a big number. That means, though, that CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. 0.04% of the atmosphere. You say, well, that's such a tiny number, it can't have any impact. I will make the point that caffeine in your coffee is 400 parts per million, and it seems to have a big effect on people. And it's really irrelevant what the percent is, because most of the atmosphere is oxygen and nitrogen, and oxygen and nitrogen don't trap heat, so they're not greenhouse gases. So they're totally irrelevant to the situation. The only thing that matters is how much of the greenhouse gases there are, which CO2 is the major one. And it turns out there's 3 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there used to be 2 trillion tons before the Industrial Revolution. So humans have increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already by 50%, which is mind-boggling. We've actually put 2 trillion tons, I'm rounding off here a bit, 2.4 trillion tons into the atmosphere. About 1.1 or so trillion remains in the atmosphere. And by the way, the rest goes to the oceans picking it up, and also plants and soils picking it up. And that's why CO2 does actually help plants grow. And a lot of deniers say that's a good thing, we need that. But it turns out that that's one way that the Earth system absorbed some of the excess CO2 that we put in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. But even now, we did a whole show on how the Earth has stopped greening, even though the CO2, extra CO2 we put in the atmosphere does help plants grow. It's not the only effect that CO2 has. CO2 makes the world warmer, and that hurts plant growth. It also causes droughts and floods, both of which hurt plant growth. And it has other effects, including increasing the vapor pressure deficit. And we're not going to go into that. We did a whole show on this. But basically, sort of the moisture on the leaf of the plant changes when the earth warms and the humidity doesn't catch up with that heating. You have a vapor pressure deficit, and that actually hurts plants. And that has stopped the net greening of the earth, even though CO2 continues to go up. So that's just a lot of data, and that's only on this one issue of CO2. So there's a lot of deniers that do that. And when I switch, by the way, you still just see the, Eli, you're just still seeing the same stuff, the comments, right? In the
yeah, on your screen share.
Yeah, because I haven't switched. Okay, so I'm going to go pick another. Okay, here's the opposite one. So let's go to here. Every time I click on an email, I'm going to get a different video, so I have to turn those off. In the past, CO2 has been many times higher than now, and there was no problem with the climate. Why should there be now? So this is the sort of an opposite thing, but this is a very, very common denier talking point, that in the past, CO2 has been, in fact, in the distant past, CO2 has been much higher. In fact, in the very distant past, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. there was just CO2. And then, of course, we had life developed on Earth that used essentially plants that used CO2 and then produced oxygen. And then there was actually little tiny single cell plants, algae and that kind of thing. And then that created oxygen, which over millions and millions and hundreds of millions of years filled the sky with oxygen. And then there were animals that developed that used that oxygen. But so super long time ago, CO2 was much, much higher. But then again, if you were plopped on that world, you would die almost immediately from lack of oxygen. But even later, when there was oxygen, you still would not have survived. And there's also a bunch of things happening. There was a lot more CO2, but the Earth wasn't much hotter because the sun was dimmer back then. So if you go back millions and millions of years, and tens of millions and billions of years, especially billions of years, the sun was dimmer, and therefore the temperature wasn't crazy. But during even the time of the dinosaurs, there was higher CO2, and the world was warmer. But you got to remember that the dinosaurs were cold-blooded, and unless, as I like to say to people, as I said in here, so this guy says, in the past, CO2 has been many times higher than they are now, and there was no problem with climate. Why should there be now? And I said, well, the Earth will have no problem with a warmer climate, but humans will. Humans did not exist when the planet was much warmer. Humans only been around for like 300,000 years, by the way, and in our present form, and just a few million years, I guess, similar forms. Unless you're planning on converting humans. Yeah, go ahead.
It also goes to your definition of what's okay. I mean, actually, it'll be worse for a lot of ecosystems than for humans. Humans can generally pick up and go somewhere, provided, like, they don't face people trying to keep them out, which will be an issue. But right. Ecosystems and all of the fine tuning that keeps ecosystems thriving really get disrupted. And an important thing to understand, even though the levels have been higher, in fact, if you go back far enough, and as high, not quite so far back, but far back, the rate at which we have higher concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, and some others that are due to human activity, that is really unprecedented. Even if you go back to the end Permian extinction event, which, as the name implies, was not pleasant, right? The rate of increases in greenhouse gases and temperatures, in that case due to volcanic eruptions, was not as high as we are experiencing and causing now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of differences, and also it did get warm on a relatively fast basis. Went up 6 to 8 degrees Celsius within 10 or 20,000 years, about 252 million years ago. That caused a mass extinction that wiped out 90% of all life on Earth. So if you think that's okay, because we're actually, moving towards, we're on our way, just hit 1.5 degrees, we're on our way to 2 and 3. And if we kept trying to do what we're doing, just keep burning fossil fuels to the end of the century, we'll get up to 5 or 6. And that will, because remember, even when we put the CO2 in the atmosphere, you don't get the full effect of that CO2 warming for about 100 years. You get a lot of it up front in the first 30 years, but it keeps warming. And again, I think the most important piece of scientific information to understand about climate change is that CO2 is not like other forms of pollution that you're used to, that go away after you stop doing it, like polluting water. You clean up the pollution, the water gets clean. Air pollution, coal plants are making it so you can't breathe. You stop the coal plants, the air gets cleaner in a few weeks, actually. But with CO2, which comes from that same coal plant, it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So it doesn't get better when you stop polluting it. and it does actually keep adding to warming. Excuse me. So anyway, this issue that CO2 has been higher in the past. Yes. See, a lot of denial talking points have elements of truth to them. Like, again, the most famous of all of them is that the climate has always changed. And I guess we should talk about that. I don't think I probably do have one of the comments here that says this, but the climate has always changed. So first of all, that is a true statement. And I usually counter that with water is wet. So yes, the climate has always changed. Yeah. Okay. So, but when a denier says that, they have to be implying, hold on, I'm going to just let a bunch of people in here. Oh, Stacy, I'm going to make you co-host here. Okay. So the climate has always changed, but they have to be implying one or two things. First, that since the climate has changed always, and humans haven't been around always, they're trying to imply that humans are not causing the current warming. So that could be one of the things. By the way, I'm going to turn off unmuting. I think Stacy and Eli, you can still do it, but others cannot. Okay.
Yep.
And
thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things you're implying is that since the climate has changed before humans were around, therefore the current warming isn't caused by humans. It's even logically not true, but that's the feeling they're trying to give you. And the other thing the other possible thing they're implying by saying the climate has always changed is that since the climate has changed before and we are here now, that has to mean that a changing climate is not dangerous. I can't think of any other reason why a denier would say the climate has always changed. I mean, it's their favorite talking point. But they don't usually say those two other things, but that's the reason they're saying they want you to think one of those two things. So let's get to the first one. First one is the climate has changed before, so humans can't change the climate. Well, there's no logic to that whatsoever. It would be the equivalent to saying there were fires, there were wildfires before humans walked the earth. Therefore, humans cannot cause wildfires. That would be the same thing. It is true that there were wildfires before humans walked the earth, caused by dry wood and a lightning strike or that kind of thing. It would be, common. In fact, some trees, like sequoia trees, require fire to sort of sterilize the soil so their seeds can grow. And obviously, they've been around a long time, long before humans. And so there were fires before there were humans, and humans can still cause fires. There was climate change before humans walked the earth, and humans can cause climate change. How? By burning fossil fuels and increasing the CO2 content of the atmosphere by 50% in less than 200 years. So there you go. It's very possible to do it. So that first implication is wrong. The second implication is the climate has changed before, and therefore it must be safe because we're here. So if the climate changing was so dangerous to humans, how can humans be here? Well, first of all, changing, quote, climates paved the path for humans. The asteroid that hit the Earth 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs, there were some small mammals back then, size of like mice and things like that. And they had to be small because it was too warm for large, warm-blooded creatures to survive. But then the Earth got cold, by the way, and there was darkness, and plants died from nuclear winter caused by the asteroid. And so there was a changing climate that wiped out a whole species, actually paved the way for us. But again, as I pointed out, 252 million years ago, the climate changed dramatically in 10,000 years. and 90% of the life on Earth was wiped out. So the implication, they don't usually say it directly, but the implication that since the climate has changed before, it must be safe, is simply not true. Also, the rate of change that humans are causing the climate change is unbelievable. It's all happening within 100 years or so, and therefore, it's a rate of change. It would be very hard for not only humans to adapt, but of course all other species to adapt. So there you go. So that's maybe the number one issue, climate talking point. I'm going to pull up a few others here. So this, getting into You're Not Galileo thing, let me pull this one up. And by the way, you'll see that a lot of the denial came on the Kevin Anderson interview, or when we were doing hope versus hopium discussion about Hanson's thing. The climate denial has been picking up. And I will say that on Twitter, by the way, there's also a tremendous amount of climate denial. It's really spiked since Elon Musk bought the company and basically opened it up back to denial, climate denial. You can tell, by the way, when I'm putting in hashtags for the tweets for these shows, I start typing hashtag climate, and then put in climate crisis or climate action, and you see the hashtags that show up under climate, and the first one that usually pops up is climate scam, which means that that's the one that's getting most of the hashtags. So, and you can see it, and sometimes climate action doesn't pop up, or climate crisis doesn't even pop up sometimes. So anyway, you can tell that climate denial is certainly on Twitter, but also on YouTube. YouTube, I think, still tries to, stop maybe a lot of totally fake videos from being posted, but people love getting in the comments and talking about that. So anyway, here's a guy who thinks he's Galileo. Yeah, go ahead.
It's worth mentioning that this is like the noisy minority. They are so active because they need to make it look like more people think this way. It's a concerted campaign, and the more obvious it becomes that climate is bad and we really need to do something, the louder they're going to get.
Yeah. And again, I'm highlighting this today more as a climate science education show, as opposed to really trying to shame the deniers or something like that. I mean, they're not going to care. They don't care what you say, about them at all. And they're going to keep doing what they're doing. So I'm not even expecting this is going to shut them down. But I do it because it's something that anyone who follows climate, who follows this program, follows any other climate programs, and you start reading the comments, you might wonder, well, what's going on here? It seems like that's a good argument. Wait, I don't understand. So I'm just trying to give you some feeling for how to think about some of these denial things, and classify some of the major ones. And then there's this one here from Bob D251, complete, and this is our interview with Kevin Anderson. Complete bloody nonsense. You people have to get out more often. There is no way to know how much, if any, of the current natural warming cycle is caused by rising CO2. The microphysics of the global atmosphere is indescribable. It is beyond our understanding at this time. A belief that we are facing some sort of a climate crisis due to rising CO2 is not based on science. Why do we call deeply held beliefs not backed? What do we call deeply held beliefs not backed by science? Religion is one. Superstition also fits. Groupthink fits. Not really thinking. So this is, and there's a lot of different flavors of this, but basically it comes in the sort of the two flavors that we can't know. That's one flavor of it. And the other one is I know, and all the scientists are wrong. I did my own research and I found out that CO2 effect is logarithmic, which it is. and then they go into this very complex description of what they figured out and links to something or other. And it's and I just classify this as You're Not Galileo, because Galileo was someone who realized that the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. And yet the whole world back then, for religious reasons, other reasons, thought that the sun went around the Earth, because it looks like it does when you're sitting on the Earth. And so here's an example of a lone scientist who bucked the establishment, who figured something out, and it turned out everyone else was wrong and they were right. That was Galileo. And so these people who think that they figured it out and that all the climate scientists are wrong, they never really considered that CO2 is logarithmic effect. Of course they do, but these kinds of things. And so I classify them as that. And then I just responded to this guy. So you're saying that we don't understand the physics of CO2, which is not true. So CO2 can't be, and you're also saying so CO2 can't be causing the warming we are experiencing. Well, that's a failure of logic. And this is also from a cartoon, which is a guy sitting at his computer, turning to his wife and saying, "Honey, I just figured out something that all the world's climate scientists overlooked." And that's sort of what this classification is. And I said, "You're not Galileo." And by the way, in the comments section, well, not in the description of this video, are links to two articles. One is You're Not Galileo, which is basically these lone people saying they figured something out, whether it's about COVID or climate change or something. And also there's a book, I don't remember the name of the book, but there's another reference to You're Not Galileo, which is a book review about something on a similar topic. So you can check that out if you'd like. And anyway, he responds to me that you're wrong. They lack a physical model of the atmosphere, which of course is an absolute falsehood. I mean, what is a climate model? It's a physical model of the atmosphere. Now, there's a whole other set of denial that says the models are wrong, or the atmosphere is so complex that the models can't possibly reflect everything about the atmosphere. And by the way, that's true. And that's true of all models. So, we landed on the moon using models, and those models were not correct in the sense that there were some errors in them. And there is a general phrase that goes like this: all models are wrong, though some are useful. And that is true of climate models. They're all wrong, just like all scientific models are wrong. If you want to get into, because remember, they're modeling the real world. They aren't the real world. And so at some level, they're going to have to sort of make assumptions or do something to correct for the lack of detail in the physical nature of their modeling. But still, climate models are very accurate. Jim Hansen modeled what the temperature would be today, back in 1988. And it turned out, and he made certain assumptions, because how warm it is today depends on how much greenhouse gas we would put in the atmosphere in the future, starting from 1988. So he took like three scenarios, A, B, C, like a very high scenario, one where we cut back on emissions, and one where we kind of middle of the road. And it turned out his B scenario was quite close to what the actual emissions were. And it turns out his temperature estimate was almost spot on. And there's a lot of, you can look this up and see there's people that have compared all of the climate models going way back, and predictions of temperature going back actually even to the 60s sometimes, and see that for the most part, not every single time, but for the most part, they've been quite accurate. In fact, there was one I saw that if you took all the models since the 1970s, I think they had, let's see, it must have been like 19 of them. He said 17 of them were indistinguishable from the reality within the margin of error of even the direct temperature measurements. So
I think it's good to note right now that it's like they can say the models are wrong and they are correct at that about that. But now it's becoming clear as additional effects become more important, that yes, in fact, the models are wrong and do not explain why the rate of warming is increasing as quickly as it is. So absolutely right, the models are wrong, but the implication that they want to make about it is 180 degrees off.
Okay, and by the way, just keep going on this one here, because we did have a little back and forth. I said you don't seem to understand understand science, because he's just saying, you need to have what he said. I told him that you're failing in logic. He said you're absolutely wrong. The lack of a physical model of the atmosphere, they hypothesize the effect of additional CO2 from the behavior from just lab experiments and how it affects the atmosphere, which, in case you haven't noticed, cannot be replicated in a lab. For God's sake, don't you people think? You don't have an answer to that. This is what all modeling efforts try to project. Hypothetical modeling is not scientific proof. If they had scientific proof, there would be no debate. So it's all unproven hypothesis, but they convince people like you it's proven, settled science. It's not. It's an unproven hypothesis at best, and it seems highly unlikely if you actually took the time to consider what many skeptical science have to say. So, by the way, so this is a very basic thing about science that people get confused. There's no proof in science. There's proof in mathematics, but you have hypotheses that you can disprove in science. And if you don't disprove them, then your ability to rely on them increases over time. And then you try all different experiments and you see that this hypothesis seems to work. And then you get to be so rely on it that no one's disproven it. It really applies, and it seems to really help you predict what's happening in the world. And then you call it a theory. And the word theory in science is very different than the word theory used by the general public. In the general public, theory means I'm kind of guessing at it. I have a theory as to why this is happening, but I really don't know. I'm really unsure. That's what it means for most people. But in science, a theory is the highest form of understanding and is equivalent to the word law. So we have the theory of gravity, which is essentially the same as the law of gravity. We have a theory of climate science, which is like the law of climate, the law of CO2 effect, for example. And so the people like this guy get confused between that. He says, well, if you were right, why don't you prove it? And that kind of thing. And you don't actually prove things in science, but you do reinforce the hypothesis, and you develop theories, and those theories become useful. And then we had to tell him that. And then he goes back with this Galileo quote: in questions of science, your authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual, Galileo. So again, he's trying to say he's Galileo, which he's not. By the way, there could be a Galileo, and if there is a Galileo in the climate world, it's Jim Hansen, because Jim Hansen has been saying for a very, very long time that the general scientific community has been underestimating the impacts of warming. We've done lots of shows on that recently. His Global Warming in the Pipeline paper late last year said that the ECS, the Earth Climate's climate equilibrium, sensitivity, sorry, how much the Earth will warm for a doubling of CO2 is 4.8 degrees Celsius instead of what the IPCC assumes is 3 degrees. And he also said that the cooling from aerosols is much higher than what the IPCC assumes. And those two things really impact our future. And yet the scientific community, for the most part, turned their back on him. It's trying to change now that the data is coming in that he was right. So there are examples where it's not alone. He's not alone in it. He had other folks like Leon Simons, who we've interviewed multiple times, and others that have said the same thing. But for the most part, he was bucking the trend. So there are examples even today of people bucking the trend.
Being invited and then disinvited from the IPCC, adds to the Galileo comparison a bit.
But so while Jim Hansen might be Galileo, this guy Bob D251 is not Galileo, and that's why that article I think I sent to him, yeah, from skeptic.org, you can see the link right there, and the link is in the in the description of this video on YouTube. And then so if he's said, well, if you're so sure of yourself, why don't you then publish your findings in a peer-reviewed journal? You can go then collect your Nobel Prize for, you know, showing why all the climate scientists were wrong. Anyway, and then he just does, you know, they usually get to insulting things after a while. Anyway, so that's that. I see we have a let me get back. Let me turn off the sharing for a second. Get back to this, and I'm going to ask Beverly if she can unmute and ask her question here. I'm going to also open up the video. I think I go to security. Hey, Bev, you have a question? I see your hand is raised.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I know.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I just put it in the
yes,
chat.
Yes, it can.
Okay.
Okay, what was your question?
Okay, so it seems, it's not a question. It seems to, I mean, I put it in a question form, but it seems to me like as the climate change is happening, it's here, it's happening now, the weather events are getting worse. It's news about it all over the world, it's affecting the whole world. Seems like those deniers, I mean, people who are the group of people who are undecided, or either undecided or they're were not concerned before or getting concerned. So I mean, it seems so obvious to me. You're getting concerned, and so that's the main group that we want to sway, and the deniers are just going to become become a dying breed, aren't they? Because even though they have more access, the deniers have more access now with X and, you know, maybe TikTok, and they have more ability to get their voice out. But I would think that the body of people who are not heavily into climate and that needs to be swayed, that they're just seeing it naturally. That's sort of my question and my comment. Thank you.
Well, there's actually a lot of things going on. So first of all, there's a whole political party in the United States, the Republican Party, that doesn't officially believe in climate change. Not that they would deny it now if you said it to them, but they don't think we should do anything. They kind of ignore it at best. They used to deny it. Now there's still some that deny it.
They want us to blame China.
Yeah, or blame China. There's a lot of things like that. So so denial has morphed. To some people, it went from it's not true to there's nothing we can do about it, right? They just went from one to the other. So like, why bother? Let's keep burning fossil fuels. It won't make any difference. And that's a big part of it. They don't, quote, deny it, but they say, if we spent $1 trillion doing this, it would only lower the temperature by 0.01 degree or something like that is a common refrain. So so there's still a lot of this denial ethos going on in very high places around. And by the way, I think we're all in denial, by the way, all of us. It's very hard to really take in what we're doing here and what's going to happen. It's just so outside of our normal life that it's just hard to do. I mean, so we have, like, on one side, Republicans that deny, you know, maybe even actually deny it, or at least say, let's not do anything. But then we have in the United States, our progressive party, the Democrats, who say, oh, yes, we're very concerned about climate. We have to do something. And look, we did the Inflation Reduction Act and all this kind of stuff. We're doing so much. It's great. We're really fighting climate change. But we're not fighting climate change. We're because at the same time they do the Inflation Reduction Act, they approved the Willow project, a big fossil fuel project, and we do other. We're not, you know, by the way, it's so simple. The amazing thing about climate change, we know about the science of it. We know what's causing it, mostly the burning fossil fuels, and we even know what to do about it. By the way, if you have a problem where you're burning fossil fuels and it's causing climate change, maybe what you should think about doing is cutting back on the burning of fossil fuels. But we don't do that. And even the Progressive Party, the Biden administration, doesn't do that. What we do instead is, hey, let's subsidize renewables, because I heard renewables are instead of fossil fuels. And that's kind of true, but renewables don't stop climate change. Only stopping fossil fuels stops climate change. And we won't do that because it might hurt the economy a little bit in the short run, even though it would help the economy tremendously in the long run. And so even the Biden administration is in a form of denial. It's not quite the same thing. They believe in climate change. They believe it's very bad. They believe we should do something about it, but they're not really willing to face, the real consequences of what's happening here and take the actions that are kind of obvious, I would say, if you were really serious about climate change. Eli?
Yeah, to be clear, stopping fossil fuel emissions doesn't stop climate change. It just stops us accelerating it further. The bad news is that the natural systems are responding in ways that are accelerating it anyway, which doesn't change the fact that we have to stop emitting carbon from burning fossil fuels. But we also have to understand that we have been making the problem worse for so long that just stopping fossil fuels is not a complete answer to the problems that we've caused.
So, by the way, so let's see, before we get on to some other questions here, I do want to keep this show a little bit shorter than some of the others. So we can try to end maybe within an hour or hour, 10 minutes or something. But I want to bring up the issue of Guy McPherson. So Guy McPherson is a person who's been around a very long time, probably I think as long as I've been doing this, so 20 years or so. And he has always been on the cutting edge of saying we're all going to die. And I don't mean we're all going to die someday. We're all going to die very soon. And he's been doing this for 10, 15, maybe 20 years. I've been asked to be on a panel with him once, and I just refused because just be getting on a panel with what I consider to be the opposite of a denier, someone who takes real climate science and makes it far worse than it actually is. I mean, and again, we always get into this, it's bad enough, you don't need to do that. And we, as Michael Mann maybe does, saying, with Hanson's work, okay, he's saying it's much worse. I don't think he's right. But we can all agree that it's bad enough. Okay, but McPherson makes Jim Hansen look like he's a climate denier. I mean, because he literally, and you can look him up in Wikipedia, said that there would be no humans on Earth. We would be completely extinct by 2026. So in 18 months from now, there will be no humans on Earth. And he said this not super long time ago. He said it in 2018, and he's been saying that kind of thing for a very long time. He also said there would be mass die-offs of humans by 2020. I guess there was for COVID, but it wasn't climate. And people keep in the comments saying, why don't you have Guy McPherson on your program? And what about Guy McPherson? And even in the comments here today on Zoom, someone's saying that McPherson quotes Jim Hansen all the time. Yeah. He does take all the climate science. He does read it, and he's like a doomer of doomers, I guess is one way to put it. So anyway, I don't appreciate Guy McPherson. I think he's as wrong as the deniers are, in the sense that deniers take some real information and then they exaggerate it or they change the meaning. And he does the same thing. He's right in the sense that climate change is very bad and will cause all these problems. He then just accelerates it up to 2 years from now or something, that we're all going to die. And that's not helpful, because then we don't all die in 2 years. And what do the climate deniers do? Well, they're essentially always quoting Guy McPherson saying, look, you guys, meaning everyone, all climate scientists, everyone who worried about climate change, you guys have been saying forever that we're all going to die, and we haven't. It hasn't been as bad as you said. Well, no, it's not all of us. It's Guy McPherson and a few other people that are doing that, and that's the quotes that they give. Let's go to Phillip. Phillip, Oh, go ahead, Eli, first.
Yeah, just the quick point there. There's what I call the denier to doomer pipeline, and I think this is part of the orchestrated disinfo efforts, where when they can no longer deny that, climate change is really happening and it's bad, then the next thing to do is to say, but it's so bad we can't do anything about it. So it's still a campaign for inaction.
Yeah. So anyway, let's go to Phillip, and then we'll go to Stacy after that if Stacy has a question. But Phillip, welcome to Climate Chat.
Thank you, Dan, very much. Just a comment really with regards to the dinosaurs during the Mesozoic. It is my understanding that dinosaurs were in fact warm-blooded, not cold-blooded, but of course the birds are the dinosaurs most. Yes, they're direct descendants.
Yeah, birds are dinosaurs, right? So.
Yeah, and of course birds are warm-blooded now. And the reason why the mammals were so small during the Mesozoic age was because they were dinosaurs, and dinosaurs absolutely dominated. And of course, they kept the mammals so small. And there were some larger mammals during the Mesozoic as well. But yeah, just your comments on, is the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere directly related to the size of the animals in the environment? Thank you.
Well, first, I don't know. I mean, I was talking about billions of years ago when the Earth formed and we had CO2 in the atmosphere, but we didn't have oxygen. The oxygen comes from living things. I may be wrong about the dinosaurs there too, but it still wasn't a good time. You still wouldn't survive well if you were a human back then. I guess getting eaten by the dinosaurs would be one of your problems.
There was a period of time when the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere was much higher, and it mainly affected terrestrial invertebrates. There were huge scorpions, for example, like the size of a car. And the reason that matters is because of the anatomy of how they breathe. They essentially breathe through channels in their skin, and at higher oxygen concentrations, that becomes adequate for them to get larger. So now at what compared to then is a lower concentration, you can't have as high. You can't have as high a volume to surface area ratio. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, Stacy, do you have a question or comment you want to make?
I do.
Hi there.
Thanks. So the one, sorry, and when I was saying before about the, trying to clarify sea level rise, I should have been Googling to see if there is a visual or something that sort of captures the sweet spot that you were describing. Because I've heard you say so many times about, the part where sea level rise was so much higher. If you've said the part where sea level rise was lower because of, this long ago time, I didn't get that. And I always get so worried that somebody will do as I did, not hear the whole thing or not understand it, and then run off, in some other land. Look, everything's all variable. There's nothing we can do and all that. And I also,
but just to clarify that, so during the Ice Age, 18,000 years ago, not a long time ago, sea levels were 400 feet, about 120 meters, I think, lower than today. Again, Florida 3 times wider than it is today. Land bridge to 2 miles of ice above Boston. Very, very, very different world, and it was only 18,000 years ago. So it does tell you that the Earth can change quickly, especially when humans accelerate the change of the atmosphere, unlike the slow change that happened. This is because of orbital cycles changing over 20 to 100,000 years. That's what causes ice ages. But what we're doing is directly pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. And by the way, another very important denier talking point, very, very important one, is that they claim that no, CO2 doesn't cause temperature change. It's temperature change that creates more CO2 in the atmosphere when it warms. And by the way, it is true that the ice ages are caused by first temperature changes caused by the orbital changes. And those temperature changes create some more CO2, which causes more warming, or sometimes in reverse. If it cools off, then there's less CO2, which cools it off more. And so it is true that past ice age changes were caused first by CO2 changes. And they try to imply, the denier talking point is, therefore, you're wrong when you say CO2 is causing temperature change. It's the other way around. But it turns out it's both. Temperature changes change CO2, and CO2 changes temperature. They reinforce each other, which is why these tiny temperature changes caused by the orbit causes huge temperature changes on Earth in terms of ice age, versus not ice age. But the temperature change just from the orbit alone is very small, yet it's amplified by the CO2. So that's a very important talking about. And so that was the ice age. But the other one, it was about 3 or 4 million years ago when CO2 was at 420 parts per million. Sea levels were about 75 feet higher than they are now. And that's the other side of it, right? That's not an ice age. In fact, it's before the recent 800,000 years of cyclical ice ages. There was, back 3 million. So we're at a climate now, we're at a CO2 level that humans have never experienced. Humans been around for about 300,000 years. The last time there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere was about 3 or 4 million years ago. Go ahead, though.
I need the Sim Earth or the video or Climate for Dummies version of that says, here are the inputs that were happening, so that, and this, here's where the way things were, and here, like, you've explained it, but it's like I need a visual to tie in with it as well, because honestly, I mean, it's been 3 years of us doing this, and I'm still sitting here like, okay, I think that makes sense. I get it, but it's a lot, and it's like, and I'm here every week. So when somebody who's not as involved or invested or, or believes, has a baseline understanding of things, here's these things, it's like, it's so easy to pick out the pieces and say, because this is so inconvenient. What is happening is severely inconvenient to the way we have built this world, the way that we currently live our lives, the way, society and economy and governments, all of these things function, our daily lives. It's like, there are people who just want to go to the country club, and there are people who just want to raise their children not to die. There's this whole breadth of humanity, and we can only take in so much and understand it. And I'm someone who is hyper focused on this issue, and I have trouble following, like I'd have to, study and watch a thing to get that more. And so I get why people don't want to change. And so they will grasp on to anything to sort of say, well, this is why we don't need to change. And the thing I come back to is it doesn't matter why it's happening. Even if the planet were doing it, even if it were some force that seems completely beyond ourselves, like the asteroid. Hi, like no one invited the asteroid to come hit the Earth, right? But if the dinosaurs had the awareness and any sort of ability to stop it, I think they would have,
Actually, we had NASA, the program. Actually, my friend Rusty Swikart, Apollo 9 astronaut, started the B612 Foundation back, it wasn't that long ago, when people didn't care about asteroids. He pointed out that it's one of the biggest preventable natural disasters. Yeah. And that, by the way, it's every few hundred years an asteroid hits the Earth that's big enough to destroy a city. It happened when it was the last one, the early 1900s in Siberia.
I think. Yeah,
1908 in Siberia. It knocked down every tree for 60 miles and would have killed a lot of people, but it happened in a place where there was no people living except for some trappers and things like that. So he then convinced more and more people till the point where NASA, recently, was it last year, or had the mission to divert an asteroid where a spacecraft slammed into an asteroid so they could measure the change in orbit and that kind of thing. So we are actually working on that, and that is a non-human caused disaster that we're trying to prevent.
Exactly.
So you're right. We
and
do
so,
that even for non-human, and certainly human caused ones we should work even harder at.
But developing that program doesn't mean that anything has to change about our daily lives. Nothing. Everything still carries on. We just have to agree to fund it. That's all. And
well, I think Kevin Anderson would disagree with you, by the way, if you listen to our interview with him. He's basically saying that
for the asteroid
idea that we don't have to change our lives is creating
no,
lack of action on climate change.
There is no
our
error.
Lives are going to change one way or the other. What?
Oh, right. But I mean, there is no error between my thoughts and Kevin Anderson's. I'm just saying we must change everything to prevent it. We can't just have a department of save the planet. We can't write a check and just everything's all better. Every solution, no matter what, requires some amount of change, or we're just poisoning ourselves in another way. So we have to.
But we're not doing. But we're not doing that. I mean, let's be clear. That's what we have to. But by the way, I always tell people, by the way, that there's a big difference between what we must do. And by must, I mean, if we don't do it, there are really bad consequences. That's what I mean by must. So there's a big difference between what we must do and what we will do.
Yes.
And what we are doing. There's a big difference. So just because you must do it doesn't mean you're going to do it. And we prove that time and time again. So we should, yes, everything we can do to squelch the deniers, we should be doing, and to divert people's attention to what is really going to happen. Somebody on the YouTube comments made a good point that people think that climate change is going to, be the inconvenience of no more ski seasons or running the air conditioning all the time and whatever, and they don't understand the hunger and the water shortages and the human devastation that is going to happen. It's quite severe, and we are completely unprepared to deal with any of it in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and we're doing nothing to prevent it. And yes, we are all deniers, with the exception of the doomers almost, who believe, I mean, not the far end of doomers, but it's like, it's almost like there's no other way of being when you see all that's going on, and you know where we're heading is to get very sad. So anyway,
we'll still fight.
We're gonna still fight. Thanks.
Get,
And Eric,
very sad,
Eric,
or get very busy.
Right. Yes. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Eric, welcome to Climate Chat.
Hey, so I want to remind people of some really brilliant points that John Cook makes, and see whether people want to embellish on my 60-second super brief version. I'm going to my favorite the conspiracy theory handbook, which I commend to people's attention, and in particular on page 8, or hold on, no, 9. Trusted messengers, to the extent to which we can use people who used to be or are at least from a tribe where most people deny. If you can bring your Republican friend to talk to the church, I think Kathleen Hayhoe is a great example, right? Because she's, I know she was never a denier, but she's at least from the tribe where here in the U.S.
Evangelical Christians. Her husband's her husband's an evangelical preacher, so she's evangelical. So they had tended to be not believing in climate change because they were very conservative. But she's been a great person to reach out to them because she's a climate scientist and she's evangelical, and she's been great at that. Yeah.
So 4 points, right? The trusted messenger concept: bring someone with you who's at least from their tribe or used to believe what they believe. Affirm critical thinking. So a lot of conspiracy folks like to think that they're thinking very critically. So find areas where you can agree. Dan just did that, saying yes, all theories are estimates. No theory is 100%. No model is 100% accurate, and yet some are super useful. So that's a good example, I think, of affirming critical thinking. I guess it might depend on tone of voice there. Show empathy and avoid ridicule. And the last point I love from John Cook is his use of the cartoons, where he's kind of making fun of the logical structure of the argument, not the person making it. So do anybody have, do either of the three of you have anything to add or embellish on those John Cook points? Thanks.
Well, speaking of John Cook, and I was going to end with this, because today we only covered maybe the best 10% of the major climate denial arguments. I can just think of others in my head. So we're not going to be able to cover all of them. However, there is a website set up by John Cook. Let's do some sharing here. It's called Skeptical Science, and it's skepticalscience.com. And in it, you can type in your favorite myth, or the one that you hear from your uncle over Thanksgiving, or whatever it might be, or you just saw on the internet that someone's saying something. And here are, by the way, the top 10 climate myths. Is the climate's changed before? We covered that one. It's the sun. A lot of people say it's not humans. The sun is way bigger influence on climate than we are. It's not bad. We've talked a little bit about that. There's no consensus. The idea that climate scientists agree is not true. It's cooling. It's not warming. Wow. I actually got that one recently, to say in the U.S. was much hotter in the 1930s than now. First, it's not really true, but the U.S. was very hot in the 1930s. That was the Dust Bowl. But it turns out the U.S. back then, it was only 1.5% of the surface area of the globe. So that wasn't global warming. That was just regional warming. Models are unreliable. We talked a little bit about that. Temperature record is unreliable. There's the urban heat island effect. I've gotten that multiple times on the videos recently. The urban heat island effect is what's causing the warming. It's not really warming. It's just that the weather stations are located in urban centers where, because of that asphalt and buildings, it's warmer than other places. Animals and plants can adapt. We talked about that a little bit. It hasn't warmed since 1998. Well, that's an old one that's thrown out the window now, but there was a peak in 1998 because of an El Nino, and then since that time, deniers tried to claim it was it was cooling after that. Antarctica is gaining ice, which used to be popular, but also now that's only 10. There's hundreds and hundreds of them in here, and you can just search right here. And so if you're curious, if you have your favorite one or one that you really have a question about, go to skepticalscience.com and either type in the search or just browse the different ones, and you'll learn a lot. And they provide the scientific backup to the debunking that they do. And when you throw in skeptical science to a denier, they get upset and say, that's BS and all that kind of stuff, because they really hate it. That it turns out their arguments have been debunked, not just for recently, but for decades they've been debunked. And so they still try. So anyway, I'm going to leave on a sort of a happy note, that you can actually go to skepticalscience.com and learn a lot more. There's no way I can, in an hour, go through all the denier talking points, but I hope I gave you a flavor of what some of them are like. Eric, you have anything else to say about that?
Just to drive home the point I was trying to make. So when he has a cartoon where somebody has a little dropper and says, sure, you can drink it, it only has a trace amount of arsenic, right? The idea that when someone is saying, well, I mean, it's such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide, it seems to me the structure of the argument looks a lot like someone who says, it's fine to drink it, only is a trace amount of arsenic in it. How is that how is this argument different from that argument? I love these cartoons because they're not text,
they're very good.
right? You can see in one moment, oh yeah, I wouldn't drink the water with a little bit of arsenic. They're kind of fast.
By the way, you're also reminding me that first of all, if you want to see more videos that we've done recently and you're new to the channel, first of all, please subscribe. Please like this video so more people see it. But also go to the Climate Chat YouTube homepage and you'll see lots of videos. One of them that you can see, which listed under Dan's videos, is a video I made in 2010 showing how 280 parts per million of ink in water turns the water from clear to dark gray, and then adding a little more to where we are today, which back then was only 385 parts per million, not the 420 that we're at now. It really makes a big difference. So things in very small quantities can have very big effects. And that's just a video that also tries to answer that. It can't be CO2, it's too small approach. Plus, you'll see lots of other great videos, including if you go to click on the live, you'll see the past live stream we've done with Jim Hansen, Kevin Anderson, Doug McMartin, and Leon Simons, and many others. So we're really building up a great group of interviews. And speaking of interviews, next week, our special guest will be Dr. Yi Tao, who is like the chief science officer for MEER, MEER.org, which I forget what it said. It's about putting mirrors on Earth to reflect the sun away to cool the Earth. We've talked about solar radiation management using sulfur in the atmosphere. And that way, we talked a lot about that. We had Doug Martin on. And that's sort of a mainstream way to cool the Earth while we get rid of CO2 and do the other things we have to do. But MEER is a little more out there kind of way of doing it, where you put mirrors on the ground to reflect the sun away. I've heard about this for a really long time, but I've never really had a chance to have a deep discussion with the folks behind it. So this will be a very interesting discussion because, I mean, just rough, order of magnitude, we have to reduce sunlight by about 2% to counter global warming. Well, the United States is less than 2% of the surface area of the Earth, including Alaska. So you're talking about a lot of mirrors if you're going to really cool the Earth in a significant way. Now, I don't think they're proposing that we go immediately to cool the Earth 100%, but I think they're going to talk. He's going to talk about regional cooling and things like that. But it'll be a very interesting discussion next week. Dr. Yi Tao from MEER, MEER.org. And so listen on that. Go listen if you haven't heard yet. Go listen to our past discussions, again, with folks like Jim Hansen, Peter Didlitson, Renee Van Westen, talking about AMOC, a lot of discussion about AMOC, a lot of discussions about Jim Hansen's global warming, the pipeline paper, lots of stuff like that. So a lot of good stuff. Spread the word so more people hear about us, and so we can reach more people.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Dan.
Stacy.
Nadia has her hand raised.
Okay, Nadia, I will ask you to unmute, and if you can, let's see, you can start your video if you want, Nadia.
All right, here we are.
Hi.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think maybe I think the distinction with dimmers is that's really critical is how you respond. So even though like somebody might say, oh well, half of humanity will die, the main thing is you still need to do something about it, as opposed to somebody who's saying it's unavoidable, therefore do nothing. I think that's the real critical part where you want to shoot somebody down in terms of the doomerist aspect. But go ahead.
Right, and by the way, there's different kinds of doomers too. We had an interview with Elliot Jacobson, and it turns out he's a doomer he doesn't like what I said. He says he's pro-nature, but then discussing it with him, I realized he's pro-doom. He wants doom to happen because he thinks humans are destroying nature. And by the way, I'm not disagreeing with him. If your point of view is that nature is the priority and humans are not, And I think it's very logical to say we should get rid of humans. So I'm not saying to do that. I'm saying, it's just a philosophical point of view that he has. And so that's
He
one
actually,
kind of doomer. There's a,
he
go ahead,
actually
Eli.
blocked me when I pointed out that if we turn things around, we can actually restore nature deliberately in ways that'll bring it back faster than it would if you just got humans out of the picture. And he did not like that. He blocked
me. He blocks people? I didn't realize he's into that. Okay. But anyway, but he asked me, he said, I don't like that phrase, pro-doom, but I like the phrase pro-nature. That's one kind of doomer. There's other doomers who simply say, it's too late, there's nothing we can do, etc. But I put Guy McPherson in a different category because look, I say things are bad. And even if we took action now, they're still going to get worse. I say that. The difference between me and a doomer is I think, well, it's a really big if, we take serious action, I think there's steps we can take to at least hold off the doom for a while longer, and maybe we'll get smarter and take other actions to restore nature and things like that. We could. I'm not saying we will. And I think the doomers simply say, well, we're not going to. But then there's Guy McPherson, who's a very different thing, because he takes the data that we have. He takes the data from Jim Hansen and everything, and then he exaggerates it to the point saying, not just that we're doomed sometime in the future, in 2 years, there will be no humans on Earth. And that's going a little bit too far.
Yeah, but even if you say, okay, well, might be billions that will die. We can still do things to lower the body count, make them less miserable as time goes on, and so on. So it's not.
And again, there's probably a million kinds of doomers, by the way. I don't think we can classify them even in 2 or 3 buckets. It'd probably take 10 or 20 buckets to really classify them. So
Agreed.
Everybody's
It's a big tent, and I don't think all of them are created equal, or that they should even. Yeah, there's an entire spectrum when it comes to climate and where people are, and we should probably map that out, where people are. Like the hopeful but not doing anything, the hopeful but active, the unhopeful, whatever. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
So actually, a lot of interesting comments too in the Zoom. I could see. I'm sure I'm sure we're going to get a lot of really good comments in the YouTube stream, especially once it posts after the live stream, because those are different sets of comments. But anyway, I think it's been a good discussion. I hope people have learned a bit about climate science. Go to skepticalscience.com if you have any questions about a particular thing you heard that doesn't seem to make sense. It's a great resource for this subject. It's one, I think, the best resource there is. There's lots of other resources available, of course, as well. But anyway, so thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next week with Dr. Yi Tao from MEER.org. We're going to talk about cooling the Earth using mirrors on the ground, and that'll be a really interesting discussion. Please also subscribe to Climate Chat on YouTube, and also please like the video so that other people get notified about it, and tell your friends, and keep up the fight. So thanks everyone for coming.